Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? We've got a few folks still rolling in, but looks like the count is starting to slow down a little bit. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sonia Nayak. I'm a partner in the Community Development and Finance Group here at Nixon Peabody, resident in our Los Angeles office. Thank you for joining us today on this final day of the IPED's Virtual Historic Tax Credit Summit. Today, our panel will focus on what we're calling the Historic Plus sort of segment of the program, which will be leveraging or utilizing HTCs with other tax credits and incentives. Then we'll dive immediately after this into the Q&A section where you can ask questions about either the panel today or past panels that have occurred during the course of the conference. We are always grateful to partner with Cone Resnick, and we are looking forward to being back in person on June 16th and 17th in DC next year. We would also like to extend our thanks to our strategic partner, the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, and sponsors Bank of America and Chase. This is just a note to remind everybody that all sessions are being recorded and will be made available after the IPED has concluded on the conference or the IPED app. Okay, so just some housekeeping matters here for CLE or CPE, and then we'll get started in the session. If you would like to receive CLE or CPE credits, the CLE New York CPE request forms have been included in your reminder email and are available for download on the conference app. Credits can only be issued for attending live sessions. We cannot issue credits for watching the recording. An attendee verification code will be provided during each session. All attendees seeking credit will be emailed their certificates of completion within 45 days of the virtual seminar. And in order to receive the credits for any of the presentations this week, you must complete and return the form to Vanessa York. If you are attending multiple sessions, please only fill out one form and send it in at the conclusion of the IPED. So with that, we're going to go ahead and turn to the panel here this afternoon, Historic Plus. Again, I'm Sonia Nayak, partner at Nixon Peabody. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to my co-panelists to introduce themselves. Kenan, why don't we start with you? And then if you could turn it over to Tim, and then Tim, you can turn it over to Rob, and then we'll get going from there.
Great. Thanks, Sonia, and thanks, IPED, for including me today. Appreciate the opportunity to chat with all of you folks. My name is Kenan Bigby. I'm Managing Director for Trinity Financial. We are a real estate development firm working in the Northeast. We've got offices in Boston and New York. I've been with the company 2 decades now, 21 years exactly. And we do multifamily primarily, predominantly mixed income. We also have a management company, so we own and operate a good portion of those deals. And historic tax credits married with the alphabet soup of other affordable and workforce and mixed income resources is a good chunk of our business. So happy to get into this conversation today. Hand it off to Tim to introduce himself.
Great, thanks, Ken. My name is Tim Karp. I'm based in Los Angeles. You may be able to see the reflection of Disney Hall and the Broad Museum in the background to give away my exact location in downtown. I lead JP Morgan Chase's historic tax credit equity origination activities around the country. We're aligned under the commercial real estate umbrella under community development banking. So we take a very much a real estate driven approach with our investing, trying to marry that with community impacts. You'll hear about some projects we've invested in today that do exactly that. We invest nationally with a focus on our core bank footprint, but we'll do anything anywhere. And we now have bank branches in all lower 48 states. So that footprint is expanding very quickly, and all those markets become that much more important as we gain foothold in those spaces. We focus primarily on multifamily and commercial assets with our investing. And then we're also really focused on how we can use historic tax credit equity to drive more affordable housing around the country, whether that's capital A affordable housing or lowercase a affordable housing. We're really focused on being creative with the way we use historic tax credit equity to do that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thanks, Tim. My name is Rob Shrest. I am the lead for tax credit originations in the Northeast, but I do focus a lot across the country as well. We are a national low-income housing tax credit syndicator, and everything we do does have a component of the low-income housing credit on it. However, we do a ton of historics across the country, and as we get into a little bit later, more and more. You know, as the housing stock ages, as building age across the country, we are seeing more and more historics. It's something we love to do. I have the honor of being on the executive committee of Preservation Massachusetts. You know, it's a wonderful organization, lots of advocacy. Can't speak high enough of that group as well, but I look forward to speaking with you this afternoon. I appreciate IPED for having me on.
Great. Next slide, please. So on this here today, we're going to focus on a couple of different topics. One is both Tim and Rob, you know, just hit upon HTCs and housing. That's sort of a hot button topic right now on every sort of investors or developers plate, you know, in any sort of credit, I think, arena. And then we're going to dive down into housing and talk about affordable housing, LIHTC, and then even some RAD programmatic considerations to take into account when pairing them with HTCs. We'll also be talking about HTCs and new market tax credits, and then time permitting, perhaps even some additional incentives such as opportunity zones. So on that note, let's start with just sort of a general discussion. You know, Rob, you mentioned, you know, that, you know, with housing sort of becoming a priority, we're definitely seeing affordable housing becoming more and more of almost an emergency level type of issue here in Southern California. And I think the same is true in other metro cities across the country. Can you just sort of talk about general themes of what you're seeing insofar as how HTCs are being used to help with addressing this issue that several cities are facing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great tool. You know, California, Massachusetts, New York, some other locations have a good amount of soft money. And even when there is enough soft loans, and kind of mentioned the alphabet soup we see at times, it's still not enough, right? Because it might be enough for that particular deal. It's not enough for what the location needs and what the demographics really need. So while there are tools, they're limited, and it's difficult to get all the units built that need to be built. So enter the historic tax credit. It pairs beautifully with the LIHTC. They both have recapture periods. They both have a complicated tax structure, and the LIHTC world is ready for the introduction of the historic credit on it. Lots of the same groups use it. The attorneys are aware, so it's a pretty natural fit. The investor side of the world understands as well. Of course, we'll get into a little bit later, but it adds a level of complexity. Some might call that a level of extra fun. Certainly some more challenges, but it's a huge tool. You know, I wrote down one note, working on a deal right now. It's a 60-unit deal, about $25 million of total development costs. And the federal historics alone are $4 million. And so without that, the state agency would have to come up with that, you know, that out of their alphabet super soft loans. That's really tough to do. And that's $4 million that comes out of other new construction ground up transactions that this particular mill is unique to. And I know we're seeing a lot of people gravitate towards old schools, towards mills, towards just, you know, older office buildings and converting them for that exact reason. They can make their deals pencil much more easily, have much lower asks from their state agencies, again, to be able to get these deals to pencil.
That's a great, actually, segue into, I think, my next question. You know, you said old mills and schools and just general old buildings. Tim, what constitutes a historic building? And, you know, in the context of that sort of definition, how does that open up the world of what's available, you know, to rehab or repurpose for housing purposes?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question, and piggybacks a bit on what the real preservation experts were talking about yesterday, right? Of buildings that are 50 years old, that are built in 1971. For a lot of the development community and even us as historic practitioners, that's often what we not think of as a historic building. We think of that pre-war 20s, 30s build as the historic building, and now you have a lot of really interesting, I think from a development perspective, really interesting pieces of real estate that qualify that, you know, you or I walking down the street may not think of necessarily as historic, but it turns out they are based on the program specs. And yesterday we heard a lot about some of the detailed design considerations that developers have to take into account. I think one of the really interesting things that we've seen with some of our clients with some of these types of buildings is that often they can be very much a blank canvas for a developer. Sometimes it is really just focused on facade preservation, maybe a few key items in the interior, but by and large, often a prior user, particularly if it had an office use, probably stripped out anything that was historic of value, and it can be a really great canvas for real estate development. So that's something that obviously depends project to project what it is, but we've certainly seen a lot of developers who have used the historic credits to their advantage on those types of transactions.
Great. So
And
Kenan,
I think the other piece to piggyback also on what Rob was talking about as well is that, you know, a lot of these projects are really well located in markets that haven't necessarily seen a lot of development over the last 20 or 30 years. And when you're able to pair federal historic credits with state historic credits, it can really help take a project that otherwise wouldn't work to being feasible. So producing additional housing, whether it's market rate or affordable, in a really well-located spot.
interesting. So Kenan, I guess to piggyback off of what Tim just said and what Rob touched on, and so far as, you know, deals perhaps that may not have worked, and sort of the lift or the extra sort of load on the state agencies to help, you know, sort of make these deals pencil or share in some of the capital stack that's needed to get them built. What has your experience been sort of across different marketplaces with respect to the different housing authorities and when HTCs are introduced into a development?
Yeah, I would echo my fellow panelists. We enjoy working with the historic tax credit. The fact that it sort of scales with the deal, where those costs, that basis incurred, generates additional resources. We like similarly pairing it with a low-income housing tax credit, especially in a bond execution, and a 4% credit sort of has that same impact. And then typically we're working in states that have a state credit as well. So those sort of all work well together. They scale with the deal and help take some of the pressure off of the other resources, whether it's state, local, or federal. And yeah, we have had success working with housing authorities specifically. And I'll walk through a case study that we were able to do that. So that, you know, layers on some HUD dollars or housing authority capital dollars. To be honest, it's a model that we like, but haven't been able to implement it as widely as some of the more typical historic and housing deals, i.e. The schools or the mills that Rob talked about. So it's a little bit of a niche market, but we think there's an appetite for it, and we've been able to work through it with housing authorities. And I do know that there is a listing out there of historic public housing development. So there should be more opportunities to do that, and we've been talking with housing authorities about trying to replicate that model as a way to preserve or expand public housing portfolios.
So let's drill down on this a little bit from the developer's perspective, because you've talked about here, just summarizing how it's they're compatible and it's easy to overlay with some of these other types of incentives. But what are some of the challenges or pros and cons to when you're adding these additional sources of financing onto the deal structure?
So the challenges aren't specifically with layering on these additional resources. I think the challenge is in sort of aligning the goals of the historic tax credit and the regulatory agencies that oversee that program with the sort of housing production goals and cost controls and sort of all of the things that go along with stretching those affordable housing dollars as far as they can be stretched, right? If you're sort of looking at the deal solely from preservation or historic perspective, sort of additional costs to preserve historic elements or to source specific window types that may not be the most economical, there's some friction there. And so that to me is where you sort of do the work to align those interests and get the deal put together. Sort of once you've passed that hurdle, again, I think I agree with Rob, these resources really work well together. So that's sort of how I would frame that. I also think as with any development deal, the plan and the budget and sort of the closing documents are one thing, but once you get into construction, that's sort of a whole nother world. And sort of with typical ground up construction, you've got unforeseen conditions in the soil or unforeseen structural challenges that you may need to deal with. But once you're sort of out of the ground and building vertical, you pretty much build what you've drawn. On a historic deal, once you get into the building, you have a higher chance of finding things that you maybe didn't anticipate. So solving those problems is another challenge, especially where, again, those resources are finite and it's not easy to recapitalize a deal midstream. And so that's a challenge that we've had to deal with. And one of the aspects of sort of marrying these historic and housing programs that we always keep an eye on.
Great. And so before we get into some of your actual deals and examples, I guess, let me just turn it over briefly to Rob and or Tim, to follow up on what was just discussed from the developer perspective, but ask the question from an investor perspective, sort of pros and cons to when you're marrying the HTCs with LIHTC or some sort of affordable subsidy or other housing types of incentives. So maybe Rob, will start with you, and then Tim, we can come to you.
Sure. Yeah, again, there's tons of pros to it. It's all financial. I'm not sure there's cons per se, but there's certainly concerns and things to worry about. I think Ken touched on it a little bit. Usually when you're looking at old mills, there's a whole nother environmental component. Schools generally aren't as problematic. Office spaces aren't, but mills generally are. And so it's something that we're always looking at. That might add a little complexity to it, a little cost. I'll get into the considerations later in terms of some of the tax pieces, but there's a lot of tax components to it. There's a lot of hoops to jump through in terms of which credit follows losses, which credits follow cash. But one thing that Ken just mentioned, I think the construction risk component to a historic deal is something that we look at more. It's not just ground up. Once you're in the walls, you don't really know what you're going to find. And so we like to see sometimes higher contingencies, sometimes a little bit more of an equity or developer fee holdback. And recently we've seen slower approvals on the historic component, whether it's the Part 3s coming in, the review of how the Part 2 conditions have been met. And if that's slower than expected, the credit delivery that the investor was expecting is slower, and the whole thing kind of gets I guess laid off to Ken and his development group's risk side of things in terms of adjusters. So it's definitely something that's becoming more, the approvals are taking a little bit longer and are more detailed than they had been in the past.
Tim, do you have anything else from the investor?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob and Kenan have hit on a lot of the big points. I mean, there is some push and pull between the credits, right? They work well together, but there are definitely things that I think the development folks need to think about as they're going into it from both an accounting and a financial and then a construction perspective, wanting to make sure that everything is understood. And Rob's right. We're on any adaptive reuse project going to spend a lot of time scratching at what type of pre-development has been done, what type of demo and abatement has been done prior to financial closing. We're similar in terms of wanting to have adequate levels of contingency, but we can pare that back if we understand, hey, the development team has done most of the demolition and done some form of the abatement, so they know what's inside the walls. Something always comes up in every single one of these deals, but if you can help de-risk some of the construction through undertaking some of that pre-development, that's certainly helpful for us and generally all the investor community if you have the capital to do that as a development team. So something we're certainly taking a close look at as well in our transactions.
Great. All right. So on that note, Kenan, do you want to take us through maybe a couple of deal examples, and we can, Vanessa, next slide, please. We can see sort of real life how this is put to work. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So I've got a deal here that I think touches on a lot of the things we've been talking about. So I'll use it as sort of a proxy to just provide some examples. So the project is Randolph Houses. It's in Harlem, New York, and it is not just affordable housing, but is actually public housing. So this is a deal that we did with the City of New York and with the New York City Housing Authority. Next slide. So you see here the site. We actually did this in phases, and it basically takes up most of a city block, 114th West 114th Street between 7th and 8th Avenue. It was comprised of 36 old law tenement buildings, and it was actually slated for a knockdown rebuild by NYCHA when the State Historic Preservation Office stepped in and asserted that these buildings were historic and needed to be treated accordingly. We responded to an RFP issued by NYCHA and the city HPD to not just figure out a way to move forward with the redevelopment of this property, but also we proposed to do it in such a way that they became eligible for historic tax credits. And this was one of the more tricky processes in order to sort of get these buildings approved for the historic credit while still meeting the needs of the residents and of the housing authority and of the city. We ultimately, as is indicated here, ended up doing them in 2 phases. The buildings that you see labeled as phase 1 were actually vacant, had been vacant for a number of years, and were in a state of disrepair that you can imagine would go along with that vacancy. The buildings in phase 2 actually remained occupied even up through our completion of phase 1, and so we're in a little bit better shape. But these were buildings that definitely needed significant amounts of work. We came back with 283 units in these buildings. Each phase, while maintaining the historic footprint of those tenement buildings and actually doing 36 separate filings and applications, part 1, 2, and 3s. We were able to create common corridor, put in an elevator, sort of bring all the modern amenities to these buildings. And so again, this is an example of sort of balancing that need for up-to-date, modern, comfortable, safe, affordable housing with those historic elements. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. Additionally, here we had not just public housing units, but also LIHTC units, sort of making this truly mixed income, serving a range of families. And then we also included 6,000 square feet of community space working with our partner, West Harlem Group Assistance. Next slide. So this is just an overview of sources and uses on the 2 phases. You can see sort of pretty divergent cost profile between phase 1 and phase 2. Granted, phase 1 was a larger project, but that level of disrepair, because it had sat vacant for so long, is sort of reflected in those costs. Capital stacks are similar. The main difference being the first phase didn't support permanent first mortgage financing because of the prevalence of public housing units in that first phase. And so that was replaced with HUD capital funds and NYCHA capital funds. But the balance of the capital stack is your typical local subsidy, and then the equity generated by the LIHTCs and the historic credits. Next slide. So just some images of existing conditions. The exteriors were sort of just worn down. These light wells are sort of typical approach to providing air and light to these old school tenement buildings. You can see they were all bricked in as a sort of more modest modernization program was implemented to originally place these on the public housing roll, but that clearly wasn't going to work going forward. Next slide. And then on the interior, this is where you sort of see the water damage, sort of structural damage, sort of just sad state of affairs.
One, right? This
in
is
these
the phase
buildings.
1 building?
Yeah, these are the phase 1 interiors. So these were not occupied units. But it gives you a sense of sort of what we were dealing with on the inside, and you know, on the phase 2 side, not in this level of disrepair, but sort of the level of finish was, you can sort of see where it started. Next slide. And so the approach here was basically just a full gut demolition of these buildings. In addition, you can see in the middle image here, we were breaking through the walls of each individual tenement to create this common corridor and sort of bring it up to current code in terms of a multifamily dwelling. And then treating the historic light wells such that we kept enough elements of those existing historic tenement buildings to qualify for the credit. Next slide. One of the challenges that we ran into here was that we fully expected to sort of do the work on these partition walls, these party walls between the tenement buildings. What we didn't expect to run into was the level of structural repair that we needed to do, including full joist, 100% joist replacement in each building. So we basically built a new building from the inside out on this first phase. These costs, along with some additional structural needed in the basement and below the buildings, basically ran up change orders at an order of magnitude that I had not personally seen on a project. I think we were approaching $7 million in change orders on this deal. And so again, that's where the scalability of the historic tax credit. We also used the federal historic tax credit and the state historic tax credit here was a key component, along with the LIHTC, 4% LIHTC that scaled with us as well. But even with that, we had to put in, the developer had to put in additional dollars, both during construction, but also in the capital stack on a permanent basis. Chase was actually the end investor here. We did work with Enterprise Community Investments as our syndicator, but Chase was our end investor here. And part of the solution was working with them to waive the upward adjuster cap, right? You can imagine with all these additional costs, generating additional credits, it's all well and good, but we needed to work with the investor to make sure they had the appetite and could structure in this additional capital outlay. So we were able to do that. And so through those resources, we were able to get budgets to balance and get the project completed. Next slide. And so you start to see the end result. So you see that corridor that sort of punched through each of the tenement buildings. One of the working very closely with both SHPO and NPS to sort of figure out where we could include historic elements to maintain our credit eligibility. You see that exposed brick sort of delineating each of the tenement buildings where they stopped and started, the sort of party walls. So that carries through the entire corridor. It's sort of one of the elements that we worked closely with SHPO and NPS to implement. Preserving stairs. We created a central lobby, which you see in the upper middle there, that served as the new front door for the redeveloped property. But we also maintained sort of each of the stoops and each of the historic stairs. And in lots of cases, they were stairs to nowhere, but an important element to maintain the historic credit. And then in the upper right, you see part of the community space that I talked about. And we basically built this into the garden level, rear facing garden level of this building. We weren't going to put units down there, but there was natural light and an at-grade entrance allowing us to put all of this community service, social service space in the building as well. Next slide.
So can I just pause and ask, we have a question from an attendee.
Sure.
Asking sort of if you're able to sort of quantify or generally sort of set forth for us an analysis or an example of the cost differential between this kind of level of rehab versus just doing something sort of from new construction.
Yeah, so this, I talked about, and the other panelists talked about, one of the benefits of adaptive reuse of historic structures is you sort of reduce that cost basis in terms of ground up new construction when you've got a building that's in good enough shape to give you that benefit. Here we had sort of the double whammy of not only was the building in worse shape than we anticipated going in, leading to these change orders. But even in establishing the initial budget, we recognized that we weren't going to have that benefit. And so we basically treated this as if it were ground up construction and sort of budgeted accordingly. We just missed on a couple of the elements that we thought would work to our favor in terms of the structure. I mean, we knew that sort of all the finishes, all of the interior carpentry would need to be replaced, but we ended up going all the way over on the spectrum to basically treating this as a ground up new construction project. I would say typically the order of magnitude in terms of costs, this is obviously going to be market dependent, but we would see swings of anywhere up to or between $100 to $200 per square foot of costs, efficiencies between a ground up new construction deal and an adaptive reuse deal. So that's a pretty significant savings in your typical adaptive reuse development. And then these are just images of the completed exteriors, and so you see completely repointed, brownstone restored, all the way down to the ornamental carvings in each tenement. We actually had to find an artisan where we could ship off these attachments to be restored, in often cases redone from scratch because the brownstone was in such disrepair. But the end result is something that reflects the historic character from the outside looking in, and on the inside is sort of fully modernized, including in the rear play spaces and access to the community space. So, I thought this was a good case study to sort of show the benefits and also the challenges and potential pitfalls to utilizing this model, at least from the developer standpoint. The last thing I'd say is, this is a relationship business, and these types of deals really emphasize that. It was the relationships between our design team, our historic consultant, and the close work that they had to do with SHPO and NPS to sort of figure out a program that would pass muster and that could be implemented. It was the relationships between our development team and our financing partners, whether it was the public agencies or, as I talked about, the work we had to do with our syndicator and investor to sort of help solve these problems and bring this project home. And I think this is true with any deal, but the historic LIHTC or historic other credit approach really emphasizes the need for that sort of collaborative approach, that team approach, and really leaning on your relationships and the team that you've put together to implement the project.
So speaking of relationships, Rob, when your developer comes to you and, has this sort of level of change orders in hand, can you walk us through perhaps sort of a development with some issues from the investor perspective? And earlier you alluded to some of the tax considerations that the investors take into account, and perhaps give us a deal example or two of your own.
We've never had a change order, so I'm just kidding. That's the nature of these deals. I think, Tim mentioned it earlier. We do a much deeper dive on the underwriting in these types of deals because it's just inevitable. There's going to be something that's found. There's going to be something that's more difficult, and so it's built into the documents up front, right? We talk about where our contingencies are going to be. We have pages and pages of how the adjusters will ultimately work. What actually happens is developer calls and says, "Here's my issue," and we sit down and talk about it. And we, put together a thoughtful plan, as Kenan said, how to bring the deal home, to get over that goal line. And inevitably, the investor side is always fantastic. They want to get the deal built. They want to be proud of a great project. So it involves a lot of different schedules and a lot of different analyses in terms of trying to get that, ultimate yield sort of back to square one or close to it. The yields the investors are buying at are not the yield they'd like to buy at. So to keep close to those same initial yields is very, very important. And so it depends on, it also depends on which, not to get too much into the weeds, but depends on what the outlet is, right? If it's a multi-fund, we're talking about 6 or 8 different folks kind of getting on board in a multi-fund that was previously completely closed. Whereas a proprietary investment, in kind of example, it's one group, it's one conversation. So again, it's something that happens on most of these transactions, and it's something that we're prepared to jump into in advance.
Okay. Do you have a couple of deals or additional sort of, maybe now's the time to kind of talk about the tax considerations from an investor perspective when you're putting these deals together?
Yeah, it's a good segue. So there's a few pieces to it. We said earlier that the federal LIHTC and the federal historic marry well. Oftentimes, they come along with state LIHTC and state historic. That's the case more and more across the country. We do a lot of deals in New York, upstate primarily, in and around Massachusetts. Louisiana, we do a lot of historics in, and those all have state credits with them. That provides another level of complexity. But to stick with the federal side for now, federal LIHTC follows losses. Federal historic follows cash. And so to mash those together can be complicated. What it ends up looking like is that the federal investor that owns 99.99% of the economics of the deal in terms of losses needs to have 99.99% of cash as well in the first 5 years on a historic deal. And that first 5 years is because that's the federal historic recapture period.
Right.
It's now the credit period too, but ultimately it was the recapture period. So the way the cash flow splits look is the first 5 years, the investor essentially gets everything. But in reality, luckily, my friend Kenan and others, usually there's a deferred fee, and usually there's some cash flow savings with agencies, or maybe there's a seller note. And so what ends up happening most times is that first 5 years or so gets soaked up by those pieces. And then when year 6 hits, the split reverts back to a normal 90-10. So for developers in the audience, it's not that you're giving up 5 years of cash flow, it's that it's more of a deferred fee in that instance. So something to worry about and something to be aware of if you're new to this and you're trying to put a deal together. Another component that the investors get pretty involved in early is really looking through what the developer and the historic consultant have been through in terms of the part 1, part 2, and what the expectation is for timing of the part 3s. Just because you have a part 1 doesn't mean you've got a good part 1. And so they're very, very different. They're very unique. And the timing of being listed on the National Register, the timing of being historically relevant matters a whole lot in terms of our pay-in, in terms of which benchmarks in the equity pay-ins are expecting to see it actually approved on the register, and then when we're expecting to see the part 3s. So that's a big part of the pay-in structure. And we can nerd out for that forever.
And just ask you earlier when you were talking, you were saying you're seeing delays here, especially in the part 3. Are we talking like 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Do you have a sense of on average sort of the delay out of SHPO and National Registry?
It's been specific to certain SHPO offices.
Okay.
It's all humans. So everything's just unique and different to each individual. The last year and a half certainly didn't help.
Right.
You can't approve a historic deal and make sure the part 2 conditions were met from a computer. So it's been a lot more difficult for folks. But yeah, I can't paint a broad brush on it. I just know anecdotally and from our examples, our experience, that these things are taking a little longer, which is putting some pressure on the ultimate perm conversions, which put pressure on the construction lenders. And it has been something that I guess I just want to make everyone aware of.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I had a couple other notes on some of the investor considerations. Stop me if we're getting too much in the weeds here.
You're
but
good. You're good.
I think it's interesting for folks as they're putting deals together, and comparing historic deals to just new construction deals based on our last comment from the audience. The federal historic credit is a 5-year credit. The federal LIHTC credit is a 10-year credit. By default, that federal historic credit is advantageous to the investor's yield. And so as you combine deals, we'll end up sort of combining the price per credit over both credit types. But in a pairing deal, the yield is higher because a portion of the total tax credits is taken over a 5-year period rather than the 10. And so it's one component you might want to think about as you're building out a deal new construction-wise, you're thinking of tearing down a building that's not on the registry yet. It not only will provide extra equity, it might provide better pricing for you as well.
It's true.
Yeah. You know, there's some other more detailed items, but I think that might give the investors perspective.
So, you know, I remember back in the day where, you know, the thought of pairing LIHTCs and historics on a 4% deal were just unheard of. And, you know, I'm now seeing that sort of more and more and more coming across the board. Tim, I'm going to turn this over to you. Maybe you can sort of touch upon how frequently we're seeing sort of the 4% deals now coming up on our radar. And then, you know, if possible, I know you've had some experience with combining HTCs on RAD related projects, and maybe we can dive into some of that before we get into pivoting to talk about, you know, using HTCs with new markets.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, so I think we heard a lot about this on Tuesday, people talking about the basis adjustment on a 4% deal using the single tier structure. And we've been using the lease pass-through structure more and more on 4% transactions. Certainly acknowledge it's different than using the single entity structure with a single investor. But the thing that we're seeing is that with a lot of developers who are choosing to go this route, is it's doing one of two things. One, it's either making a project pencil that otherwise wouldn't, because you're generating on any type of sizable transaction 7 figures of additional LIHTC equity proceeds. Right. So we're seeing developers tell us, and one of the examples that we'll have later on in my slides, that deal doesn't pencil without using the lease pass-through structure. So that you're certainly seeing transactions like that, that we're seeing around the country. And I think all of our, particularly in the community development space, we're trying to produce more affordable housing. And if we can use this structure to do that, it excites us and is something we're certainly on board with doing and figuring out. No doubt there's some complexity, but I think the thing that we're seeing is that in the development community, as folks are doing it 1 or 2 times, they then are seeing more and more opportunities that make sense to them on the development side from understanding and knowing how that structure works. The other thing it can do is if a project pencils, is it can also eliminate the need for some other type of municipal subsidy that likely has some type of painful approval process to get that may be slowing down your development timeline. So I think from both of those perspectives, we're certainly seeing the development community in the affordable space want to use it more. It's not a fit for every transaction, but there are certainly ones where it does make sense simply because of the economics of being able to generate that additional subsidy. And then Sonia, you hinted at the RAD conversions you were working on.
Yeah, but before we get there, just one question that I was just sort of thinking about as you were sort of sharing that. I'm curious as to why you think we're seeing an uptick on those types of deals, given how low rates are generally, right? Like somebody's rate on a straight construction to perm, you know, why is it worth sort of, you know, moving forward with the extra sort of headache that goes along with a bond transaction, given how, you know, how cheap debt is essentially right now?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the cost of capital of historics versus anything else out in the market. I think I feel like every day on LinkedIn, someone is announcing some new, you know, affordable or workforce or preservation fund. And while it's great that there's more capital flowing into the general affordable arena, it's still got, there are lower returns than you typically expect for equity, but there's still, equity minus how many of your 100 basis points you're seeing. And historics are a lot, the cost of capital is a lot lower than you would see from some of those other sources of financing. So I think folks are doing that math and quickly seeing that there's benefit to using historics in a bond deal, 4% bond transaction versus capitalizing a transaction in another way.
I think also, Sonia, and Ken saw it on his deal in Harlem, you're not capped at the 9% award. There's just a lot more resources in terms of the credit that way. Either just initial underwriting, or if you do have cost overruns, you're not capped at that award amount. You can bust through the adjuster caps.
So Tim, typically, on RAD developments, we see it paired with LIHTC, and I now understand we're doing large sort of RAD conversions with HTC, state and federal equity. Do you have some examples of that? And would you like us to share, Chase's experience and your experience with those types of projects?
Yeah, so they're in the closing process now. So I wish I could have a whole deck of cool slides like Kenan did to showcase the work. But we are seeing that now where folks are doing RAD conversions, not using LIHTC equity, only using federal and or state historic equity to do those transactions. And there we're providing both the federal and possibly state historic equity alongside with a variety of debt solutions, whether it's construction debt, agency debt, whatever it might be. We're bringing a number of solutions to bear in some very large scale transactions in New York City. As I mentioned, the closings are ongoing, but I think it comes down to exactly what we were hitting on before. The cost of historic tax credit equity versus traditional debt or equity is much lower, and it's a way to preserve those affordable housing units around the country. And then every municipality is supply constrained right now. So if we're able to bring private, relatively low cost capital to these transactions, it's a big benefit to municipalities that are trying to stretch every last dollar. And we hear that from housing authorities and then the finance authorities associated with them, is that the ones who understand how the historic credit works view that as a very valuable financing tool going forward, because it's capital that they don't have to come up with.
Gotcha. So we've definitely spent the bulk of our discussion around housing, and I think that's appropriate given the current landscape, in as far as the credit industry is concerned. I would like to pivot though, and with the remainder of our time here, talk about other types of incentives and or pairings with HTCs, and new markets definitely comes to mind. Tim, I know you've done a couple of HTC and NMTC deals. Do you have a couple of examples to kind of walk us through, and then maybe just talk about sort of the pros and cons of combining new markets with HTCs and how that might differ from a LIHTC kind of combination product offering?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So we've got one new markets example and then one lease pass-through affordable example we can quickly run through here.
Okay, great.
Go to the next slide. So this transaction is, we call it the PR Mallory project. It is an old manufacturing plant in Indianapolis, Indiana. Interesting history in that it was initially built by GE to do some light bulb manufacturing. While construction was ongoing, the technology changed and they determined they didn't need the factory anymore for manufacturing light bulbs. So they sold it to the Mallory company, who I didn't realize what they actually did until I did this project, but they're the ones who developed the Duracell battery. So this was part of the broader campus where they were located. They moved from New York to Indianapolis to have their new headquarters there. And this is where the Duracell battery was developed at. So it's a project that had sat in disrepair for a number of years. Obviously, when you've got battery manufacturing, you've got some serious historic environmental issues, many of which were taken care of by the city before we closed the transaction. But as folks had alluded to earlier, always got environmental issues. And here we got comfort in the fact that there was a lot that had been done before we were there, but something we certainly spent a lot of time looking at. The renovation was completed middle of last year, occupied by Purdue Polytechnic High, a charter school affiliated with Purdue, a middle school design, charter middle school designed to feed the high school, Farm 360, a hydroponic vegetable farming organization located in one of the outer buildings. And so really an interesting mix of uses that come out of what the original use was, right? Some of the original use was much better for school, and then some of the more industrial portion is now being used for a hydroponic vegetable farm. The developers on this were Englewood Community Development Corporation and the John Bonner Neighborhood Center. Those are groups who do have experience using historics and new markets in the past. So for them, it was a tool, they were tools they were familiar with, but certainly as we then look to the capital sources, very complicated capital stack. We had new markets equity, we had historic equity, we had Dino equity in Indiana, we had bonds and grants that were leveraged through the new market structure. So something to always think about when you're looking at a new markets deal, are the other sources of financing being leveraged through the new market structure, or are they going direct to the real estate SPE? Here, the bonds and grants were compatible with the new market structure, so we were able to do that. Then there were also bridge loans for the historic equity and the Dino equity, given the timing of that capital. And then we have this other long list of other support that came into the project. So really, variety of local support from different local economic organizations. But trying to figure out how that all fit together certainly took some time with the development team and with our team to bring it all together. And I think one thing that's always interesting about new markets and historic transactions is that sometimes what folks are looking for, particularly community development entities, and what they're looking for when they're thinking about the but-for test, but for this new market subsidy, could the transaction happen? You often have transactions that are very thin in terms of economics. From a historic equity investor perspective, we want to see that there's some profit in the deal to show that we're a partner in the partnership. We want to see that there's profit and potential for variability. So sometimes those can be at odds with each other, and so there's a lot of thought that needs to go into the structuring and the tax analysis to make sure that everything works. And then too, with the variety of sources of financing, that's always a complicated piece as well, to make sure that all those items are fitting together. But in the end, you end up with a really cool $36 million development. $5.5 million of the capital came from the historic equity. That's really ended up with a really cool project here that you can see some of the pictures on the exterior. And then I think the next slide shows a cool picture of the smokestack out front. Oh. So that's from the grand opening. You get to see the historic nature of the smokestack and the building itself that is the school now.
Tim, do you recall how far when by the time you arrived to the transaction, were the bonds and the grants that were used to make the leverage loan on that transaction, were they already closed, or was the developer able to sort of coincide or structure the closing at the same time so that you didn't have to go back to the bondholder or the trustees or whatnot for various approvals and modifications on that end? Because I can appreciate that would add just a whole nother layer of timing consideration and complexity if it was after the fact.
Yeah, and so thank goodness it was not after the fact. I think, and that's always one of the things that folks I think run into a lot of times on new markets transactions, is that projects are coming to new markets because there's a gap that needs to get filled. And so sometimes those other sources, the bonds or the grants, may anticipate having some type of collateral, direct real estate collateral, that you can't get in a new markets transaction. So luckily, this had been structured with the intent that it could be leveraged through the structure and have that indirect collateral. But that's something that we certainly see a lot of folks will have these other capital sources, that other 65 to 70% of their capital lined up, that's expecting to have direct real estate collateral, and then you go back and try to use it through the new market structure. We have to get very creative about how that collateral gets to them, or have the deal completely restructured from that perspective, which is less than ideal.
Yeah.
So to think about it from the development perspective, thinking about it early and giving yourself some optionality when you come to that point of, are we going to get new markets allocation or not? That's always an important piece of any of these transactions.
Great. Great.
And I think the next slide also shows the interior. We don't have much from the befores. Pretty traditional vacant building, but you can see the school build out here. Shows the conversion of the space. It's really cool. And everything we've heard is that the schools continue to do well through COVID and continues to produce the academic results that they have historically.
Great. So Tim, do you have an example of a deal, a lease pass-through structure with the 4%?
We do have one of those. Yep.
Oh,
so
great.
Go to the next slide. Well, then this is the, sorry, I forgot about this portion. This is just the lease pass-through structure with new markets. So folks can see the leverage lender. That's where the bonds and the grants came through, all the way through the structure. And then we have the typical investor, tenant, landlord, qualic B structure on the right.
And the structure chart on the projections really looks this simple, right?
Always. Well, in this one, we had 2 new markets investors, so made it even more complicated.
Yeah.
So yeah, if we go to the next slide, that'll highlight the lease pass-through deal. So this is in our portfolio one of my favorite transactions for a variety of reasons. One being the name, the Hotel Grimm, as it was historically known. There was a lot of creative graffiti inside based on the name of Hotel Grimm. It's an old hotel located in Texarkana, Texas, so right on the Arkansas-Texas border. It's a project that was redeveloped by Cohen Esri into 93 affordable units. The project had really been sitting mostly vacant for about 40 years. You'd heard stories in the community about how the hotel had closed, and there was a club in the ground floor and social club and things of that nature. But really the hotel had sat functionally vacant for 40 years. So when we walked the site, lots of debris, some of the most debris I've ever seen on a site. Interesting fact is that the development team was estimating that they were going to have to remove 2.5 to 3 million pounds of trash and debris. And it ended up being over 5 million. So it gives you a sense for 40 years of, the hotel was left as it was, and 40 years of rain and all the other environmental things that go on in a building that sits vacant for that long. They had to remove it all. So 5 million pounds. The other cool thing about this is that there are some really interesting YouTube videos and websites about abandoned buildings that walk through the Hotel Grimm. So folks are interested in taking a look at what it looked like before. You can do that simply by searching Hotel Grimm in YouTube. But this is a transaction that is one of the ones I alluded to earlier that simply didn't work without using the lease pass-through structure. So it's under construction now, will be completed later this year. And again, you see the alphabet soup that Kenan spoke to about the different capital sources. We've got federal LIHTC equity, federal historic equity, state historic equity, construction and perm bonds, local housing authority perm loan, the bridge loans, city funds, 108 loan, an EPA loan, you name it, it was in this deal. And so it was a complicated closing, but certainly an impactful one, and a community that, as you can see down in the bottom picture, so excited about this iconic building getting redeveloped after having been underutilized for 40 or so years. And I think that's one of the things that all of us in the historic industry get so excited about, is seeing these pillars of the community getting reactivated into a new use. In this deal, the local news station is across the street. So it may be one of the most reported on historic buildings in the local news. Anytime they saw someone at the site, there was a news crew out there filming to see what was going on. So really cool to see the community excitement, around a project like this. They had a big party for the relighting of the sign. So it's continued to be a cool focal point for the community. And I think in terms of, Sonia, when we think of lessons learned you'd asked about earlier, it's consistent with what Kenan and Rob discussed. Is these are, even in the closing process, they're complicated closings. You've got to have financing partners, governmental partners who can be somewhat flexible and can adapt to different changes in the structure. And then ultimately, as even after you close the transaction, something always changes. Our portfolio management team works a lot harder than I do because they have to deal with all the complications and changes that come during construction. But I think that the flexibility that everyone needs to have and the relationships to make sure that we can work through any issues that come up post-closing, because as Rob stated, they always do.
They always do. So what was the actual structure that was used to make this work?
So we did use the lease pass-through structure on this transaction to make it work, to be able to not subtract the historic credits from the LIHTC basis.
Excellent.
And so it generated significant additional proceeds to make it work. And this is all review for most folks, but just the reminder of the single entity structure that you traditionally see in a LIHTC deal. And then on the next slide, you've got the lease pass-through structure that shows how it all works.
So Rob or Tim or Kenan, we've talked about new markets and we've talked about LIHTC and affordable and even, other types of incentives on the housing front. Why don't we see sort of an overlay or a combination of renewable and historics as often on deals? Or why is that impractical?
Well, I think the renewable energy credits touches on one of the challenges I mentioned early on in sort of getting those approvals, maintaining enough of the historic fabric, and especially from the outside looking in. It's been my experience that anything that sort of deviates from that historic look and feel are hard to get approved. And so when you're talking about solar panels or infrastructure like that, it gets pretty tough. So that's one thought on that piece.
Yeah, I just don't think it's as practical or feasible. It'll be interesting to see if over time and the need for just energy conservation and efficiency, if there's a little bit more bend on that point. But
yeah, I mean, I also think the technology is still advancing, right? If you've got these Tesla roof shingles that are sort of aping traditional roof shingles, maybe there's some kind of historic solar panel that looks like a slate roof or something.
Yeah, it's an idea. I'm curious if any of you, either from the developer perspective or from the investor perspective, have actively sought out or done deals that are located in opportunity zones and have then been able to, pair sort of the opportunity zone incentives with HTCs, or is that not something that's coming up on the radar as often?
We've done a fair amount of OZ LIHTC work. We had a fund that we closed, I think it was about 5 deals in. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them were historic, and there wasn't a specific reason for that. It's just the way it worked out.
And I don't know if it's a sort of geographical, the work we do in the Northeast is typically in your high cost areas. And so layering opportunity zone, which is looking for a certain level of return with affordable, and then trying to tack on historic. I just haven't seen something that sort of is able to handle all of those bells and whistles.
Tim, how about you?
I would say we've seen a few. We actually recently closed one in the Northeast in a lower cost market in the Northeast where it worked. It was a market rate transaction. So we've certainly seen opportunity zone equity be used. I think I'm surprised it hasn't been used more frequently. I think the cases where we've seen it be used most effectively is when it's developers recycling some of their own gains into their own projects. I think it's much easier for everyone when that's the case. But we've seen it used, and I think they've been able to work fine together.
Great. All right, well then, is there anything else by way of sort of HTCs plus other types of financial incentives or credits or subsidies that you can think of that we should share with the audience here today? I think we've
Yeah, we've covered most of it, but I think it does make sense for folks as they're putting deals together or trying to focus on a historic transaction to definitely seek out the states and locales that have state credits. It's another way just to layer everything on and makes everything a lot easier. New York's done a good job recently in kind of re-envisioning how their state low income works along with their state historic, trying to make things a little bit more creative. In Massachusetts, it's always been something we've paired with. Having it certificated allows the federal historic investor and LIHTC investor to not necessarily be the same group. And so if that federal investor is specifically a CRA investor, but they don't have state liability, you can certificate those credits and lay them off to a different investor. So I guess just something to point out that as you're trying to figure out a way to put deals together, that's just a great resource to have.
That's good. We actually do have a question here for our investors. The question is, when doing a historic tax credit deal, the investor wants a reasonableness opinion. So when combining LIHTC with HTC, would an investor still require the reasonableness opinion? Is that something that either Tim or Rob can answer, or do you defer to counsel on a deal by deal sort of basis?
Well, Tim, if you want to answer the reasonableness specifically. But.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, in particular, I mean, in the 4% transactions using the lease pass-through structure, we do require a reasonableness opinion on this.
In the one you did, Tim, was the LIHTC investor and the historic investor the same entity, or were they different?
They were different.
Yeah, that's a big difference that they're different.
Yep.
So, yeah.
All right. Anything else, I guess, Tim or Kenan, for our panel here today?
I mean, I think consistent with what a lot of folks have said, I think to think about it early and often and start thinking about the accounting and structural implications, I think is key. As you know, your question on the new markets deal, hinted at folks who are trying to change midstream. You can do it. It's just it just tends to be a little more complicated and cost a bit more. Versus if you're thinking about it up front and building in that optionality of multiple ways to finance the transaction, I think is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. With historics, people always know to, go seek out a really experienced salt historic consultant early and often. I think it makes sense to seek out a experienced financial partner as well. These things can get very complicated, and unless you've done it a million times like Kenan, it's nice to get a template laid out in front of you early to avoid some of these things or take advantage of them.
Yeah, even having done a number of these, the sort of specific expertise is necessary each and every time. So putting that team together early is definitely important. I would just sort of close by saying I think the model is incredibly effective. I think the creativity in combining the different financing resources has resulted in and is evidence of the effectiveness of these programs. And it's certainly something that when we're out looking for our next round of deals, sort of finding a historic or historic eligible building is definitely reason for optimism. So it's a model that I don't think is going anywhere so long as these programs continue to be funded.
We have one final question here before we wrap up. I guess, and maybe another way to ask it here is how, on twin deals using lease pass-through, how often is it for your LIHTC and HT investors to be the same versus different?
Yeah, and they're their slightly revised question is the key here. There's almost always the LIHTC and historic are twinned and it's the same investor. But in the lease pass-through structure, I can say I haven't seen a deal done with the same investor since the whole boardwalk situation happened. So, but Tim, I'd like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some varying opinions in the legal community about what you can and can't do. I think the safest and most simple route is to have separate investors in those transactions.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank each one of you for your time here for today and your participation, and the participants who joined. We've got a great number of you. Thank you very much for your participation as well. The attendee verification code is up here on the PowerPoint screen. Please be sure to make a note of that for your continuing education submission purposes.